So today we're going to talk about scope of inference. So based on our design, whether it's an observational study, whether it's an experiment, sample survey, things like that, what are the different inferences we can make? Can we take our findings and generalize to an overall population? Can we only generalize to a specific part of our population? Things of that nature. And then we're also going to talk about some cautions, some things to be aware of when setting up or reviewing different studies. So inferences. When we talk about inferences, and there's eventually, we're going to spend pretty much all of next semester on inferences, hypothesis tests, things like that. So when we talk about inferences, researchers who conduct studies often want to draw conclusions that go beyond the data. So we don't care about the sample we selected per se. They're just kind of a stepping stone to what we want to find overall. Okay? So we have a population of interest in mind. We can't access our entire population, so we take a smaller sample that's more accessible, and we use that sample to infer information about the population. So when we talk about inferences, we're talking about taking the information we get from a sample and expanding it or generalizing it to our population of interest. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're making inferences. We're drawing conclusions based on the information we had at hand. So a couple examples, you don't have to write these down. These are just kind of ways so you can see what they are talking about as far as making inferences. So the U.S. Census Bureau carries out a monthly current population survey of about 60,000 households. Their goal is to use the data from these randomly selected households to estimate the percent of unemployed individuals in the population. Okay? So every month, they send out a survey to 60,000 households randomly selected. And what they're trying to do is use those samples to determine or estimate the overall percentage of individuals who are unemployed in the population of interest. Okay, so they're trying to infer that unemployment rate based on the sample they collect. All right, that's what we're talking about with inferences. A second example, scientists performed an experiment that randomly assigned 21 volunteer subjects to one of two treatments: sleep deprivation for one night or unrestricted sleep. The experimenters hoped to show that sleep deprivation causes a decrease in performance 2 days later. So they ran an experiment where they had half their volunteers, they kept them awake, so basically applied sleep deprivation, and then the others were allowed to sleep like normal. And then what they were doing was testing to see if sleep deprivation affects performance 2 days later. So that's what they're trying to infer based on the 21 subjects that they had to work with. Okay? So, the type of inference that we can make from a particular study depends entirely on the design of the study. So the way we create and set up our study is going to determine what we can and cannot say as far as inferences go. So what can we generalize, what can we not generalize? So this is what you probably want to make sure you have down, this little chart here. And this chart is in your book. So there are two conditions that we need to look at as far as what type of inferences we can make. First, were the individuals randomly assigned to groups? So if there were groups to be distributed through, did we do it randomly? The second criteria is, were the individuals randomly selected? So did we actually select our sample at random? Okay, so what ends up happening here? If our individuals were randomly selected and they were randomly assigned to groups, this would be like an experiment where you were able to randomly select the participants and you randomly assigned those participants to the different treatment groups. If you were able to do both of those things, you would be able to infer about the population. So you would be able to take any study or any findings you found and expand it to the entire population. You can say from this study, the population should follow this pattern. The other thing you can do is infer about cause and effect. We can definitely say then that the explanatory variable causes a change in the response. So if we randomly select our individuals and we randomly assign them to the different treatment groups, we can do both inferences, infer about the population as a whole and infer about cause and effect. Okay. Now, when we look at whether we are randomly selecting the individuals, if the answer to that question is no, so we did not select the individuals at random. So we ran an experiment. It was voluntary based. So we had volunteers come in that we selected from that group of volunteers. Now, in that experiment, we should still have randomly assigned the individuals to the different treatment groups. So we did not select our sample randomly, but we did assign the participants randomly to different groups. Now, what that does is restrict some of our inferences. We can no longer infer about the entire population as a whole. We can't take the results of that experiment and say this is going to work for everyone we were initially interested in. Okay? But we can still infer cause and effect. We can still say that based on the results of this study, this explanatory variable causes a change in the response variable. Okay. Now, if we have a study where we do randomly select our sample, so we randomly selected our sample, but we did not randomly assign them to specific groups. So this would probably be something like a sample survey or an observational study. Okay, we randomly selected who we were going to observe, who we were going to ask questions about, but there were no groups to randomly assign them to like we would have in an experiment. So we randomly selected our sample, we did not assign them randomly to groups. What we can do is infer about the population. Whatever we find from the study, we can say with some confidence that it would apply to the overall population as a whole. What we cannot say is that the explanatory variable definitely causes a change in the response. So we can definitely generalize to the entire population. We cannot say anything about cause and effect based on that. And then, if we have a study where we do not select randomly and we do not randomly assign to groups, there's nothing we can infer from those studies. We can't do anything to generalize it to the population. We can't do anything to establish cause and effect. So that's where, when we talk about the different parts of each of the different studies, randomization becomes very important. If we don't employ randomization at some step, we lose all ability to use our findings for anything. Okay? So these are some things to kind of keep in mind, because what they're going to do is they're going to ask you questions. Here's the scenario. Based on this scenario, can we infer about the entire population? Can we make a generalized statement? So your answer would have to be yes or no. Yes, we can make a generalized statement because the sample was chosen randomly, or no, we can't because the sample was not chosen randomly. If they ask about cause and effect, yes, cause and effect can be established because the participants were randomly assigned to different groups, or no, we can't because we didn't randomly assign to different groups. So that's kind of the gist of what we're getting at here. So when they talk about scope of inference, they're trying to get you to figure out what can and can't we say based on the study. Does that all make sense? Okay. So when we have a well-designed experiment, we can always determine that changes in the explanatory variable cause changes in the response. We can always go ahead and infer cause and effect when we've designed our experiment correctly. Now, one of the things like we talked about, a lack of realism, can limit our ability to apply conclusions of an experiment to the settings of greatest interest. So depending on how our experiment was carried out, if there was any sort of lack of realism to it, we have to be extremely careful with how we take those findings and try to expand from there. So that was one of those things we talked about. You want to avoid lack of realism at all costs. Try to make sure that everything within the setting follows what people would normally expect throughout the course of a day or whatever else you're doing with the experiment. Okay? When an experiment is not a viable or ethical option, we can use the following criteria for establishing causation. So up until this point, we have said if you do a sample survey or if you do an observational study, you cannot infer cause and effect. Those cannot establish cause and effect. An experiment can, those other two cannot. Now, here's the problem with that. We can't always run an experiment to study the effects two variables have on each other. So we have to have some sort of criteria set in place to say, okay, when I absolutely cannot run an experiment, how can we get to the point where we can use cause and effect? And that's where these come into play. So I want you to write these down real quick, and then we're going to discuss an example to kind of show you how this all works out. Okay? So, these criteria are necessary whenever an experiment is not an option so that we can still establish cause and effect relationships between certain variables. For instance, smoking and lung cancer. Now, if I wanted to prove a cause and effect relationship between smoking and cancer, if I tried to run an experiment, what would that entail? Giving people cancer. Okay? If we're pretty sure that smoking causes cancer and we wanted to run an experiment with that, we would have to take a group of non-smokers, we'd have to randomly assign them to two separate groups. One group would start smoking a certain number of cigarettes per day. The other group would not be allowed to smoke at all. And then we'd study the occurrences of lung cancer between the two groups. In essence, we would be giving lung cancer to certain people, right? That would not be ethical for us to do. So, since an experiment can't happen, how are we comfortable saying that smoking causes lung cancer? Because when you look at all the commercials, when you see all the ads and things like that, they've established the cause and effect relationship. But we've said from the beginning, only experiments can do that. Okay? And so that's where these criteria come in. The first one, the association is strong and consistent. There have been numerous studies on the effects of smoking in the human body. And one thing that always comes back is a very strong and consistent association between smoking and lung cancer. Okay? There's always been that. They've never had a study come back where there was not an association between those two things. So that's criteria number one. Larger values of the explanatory variable are associated with stronger responses. they've actually shown the farther or the more you smoke, the more at risk you are for lung cancer. And they've shown even that people who quit smoking actually start reducing their chances of getting lung cancer later on. So it starts reducing the risks. Okay? So they've shown these two things. The alleged cause precedes the effect in time. Before smoking was around, lung cancer was basically non-existent. And then as soon as smoking started increasing and started to become more higher in popularity, all of a sudden occurrences of lung cancer started sprouting up more and more. So the alleged cause came before the effect in time. And then the last one, the alleged cause is plausible. Okay? It makes sense that smoking would have an effect or cause lung cancer to occur more regularly. Okay? So while we aren't able to run an experiment to prove this for sure, we have these criteria in place that are met with this particular relationship, which means we can comfortably assume smoking causes lung cancer. Does that make sense? So with things like that, where you're not able to establish or create an experiment, you can still get to cause and effect. You just have to go through a more thorough process. Okay? Eli, do you have a question?
No.
So okay with those? All right, last thing, just a couple cautions. Some things to kind of keep in mind. Now these you don't necessarily have to write down, just kind of keep them in the back of your mind here. So, experiments, especially if you're trying to prove cause and effect, are probably the best studies you can run. However, if you're not able to run the experiment, so if something is keeping you from running the experiment, either cost, time, ethics, anything like that, you can still run an observational study and probably get enough information out of it to be useful to you later on. So if you can't run an experiment, don't just not do your research topic. Go for an observational study and kind of see what comes out of it. Okay? Because you can still infer certain things from that observational study. Always be aware of confounding. Whenever you're running your experiment, you have to be very cautious with confounding, looking for those lurking variables. So use randomization whenever possible to ensure that any factors not in your experiment are not confounded with your treatment levels. So the more you randomize, the more likely you are to spread out any variations that would normally occur. Okay? Also, be alert to anything that might not be avoided, like you cannot avoid this type of confounding, and make sure you report it with your results. So this was something that occurred during my experiment. It was something we couldn't avoid, so we don't know positively that the treatments caused the change as opposed to this other variable causing the change. So it's something that you just have to mention with it. It was not avoidable, so we have to be cautious with these results. Bad things can happen even to good experiments. So even if you've designed it correctly, you've run it as well as you could possibly run it, bad things can still happen. Just make sure that as you're running your experiment, you are writing down and documenting everything that happens. The more information you have, the better off you're going to be in the end. So just make sure you're always recording everything you possibly can within that experiment. If you're actually going to run a research topic, if you're going to run a research project, you want to make sure that you don't just create it and run it on a large scale right off the bat. What you should always do is start off with a smaller version, which we call a pilot. So if you guys have ever watched TV series, they always call the first show a pilot, right? That's the first show they show to see how audiences react, to see if the show is actually going to be worth anything, right? So they have a pilot season. They only go about 6 to 8 episodes. If it does well, then they extend it and give it the full treatment. If not, it just gets canceled right away and it's done. Okay? Same thing happens with experiments and observational studies. You do not want to design your study and go out and run it on a large scale. If you run it on a pilot first, you can actually see if there are any mistakes that you made. Did you word the question poorly? Did you have your correct sampling technique? Did you, whatever else might come up. So you can run a test or program and make sure that anything that you might have messed up can get fixed before you go grand scale and spend all your money, all your time on this project. Okay? So when you run that pilot program, you're going to learn things that might make or improve that particular project, so that when you go large scale, you're not wasting time and money. Okay? And that's it. That's the end of chapter 4. So here's your assignment. And as you're working on this, I'll put the answer key up on the table. What you'll have to do, though, you'll have to search for the different parts. I kind of rearranged some of the sections this year. So this was not a specific assignment I gave last year. This is kind of a combination of a couple different assignments, which is why it's a little bit longer than the previous ones. But I'll have that up on the table, so if you want to take a picture of it, you can have all the problems worked out as you work through these particular problems.